Welcome to TrineDay's Roundtable number 7, Paul and Liz's Magical Mystery Tour with Oliver Stone and how it relates to our future. Part of the series, Exposing the Failure of Empire and Reclaiming the Narrative Creation Process. These were inspired by The Valediction, Paul and Liz's two-book memoir about their journalism in Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion, their return home, where corporate media would not broadcast the truth that they had found, and their journey into history, mysticism, and the real power behind empires. In the first half, the panelists will say what we have to say. First Kris, then me, then Paul and Liz. And then we'll open it up for questions and comments. And now, Kris Millegan.
Howdy do, folks. I want to thank you all for coming out. We live in very, very interesting times, to say the least. There's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot of change happening, and this discussion. One reason we called it the Magical Mystery Tour was because right after Kennedy got shot, all of a sudden the Beatles showed up and kind of changed our sadness about the Kennedy assassination. And there are some that say that, all of that is part and parcel of what the people in the shadows have put there for us to play. And I want to talk a little bit about conspiracy and conspiracy theories. When I looked at like Skull and Bones, okay, which is a secret society that has played a big role in our history. And one thing that they do is they don't just go out and try and get all the evil people. They get people that are useful for them. And then they play them into position so that then they will do what they expect. Because how do you get to be in the Order of Skull and Bones? Well, first you have to go to Yale University. And then when you're a junior, somebody comes up and taps you on your shoulder. So what they've been doing is they've been watching you, okay, for 3 years. And so they have a real good idea of who you are and what you're going to do. Okay, so one thing about the conspiracy that we have been dealing with here in our body politic has been, quote unquote, very, very subtle. And like I've talked about before, into getting us into the little camps. And then the other thing is, what is a sovereign? Okay, besides an old English coin. Okay, a sovereign is a monarch or a king or a queen or a supreme ruler or a person who has supreme power or authority. Okay, and we live in a world where, there's a bunch of different countries that all consider themselves sovereign units, okay? And they're able to do what they want. And then they have to deal, just like we have to deal as a person, we have to deal with other people out there, okay? And we have to learn how to either get along with them, avoid them, or whatever. So it's, there is a reason why the United States of America came about, okay? Because there were people that were living, they didn't like the way that they had to live. They wanted more freedom and more liberty, okay? Instead of being ruled by, quote unquote, royals, being ruled, they wanted to rule themselves. And so we set up a democracy, okay, based upon the rule of law. And we have a situation where people are, have used the rule of law way beyond what it was supposed to be. Okay. When I was a youngster, you could have, a corporation could only own so many media outlets in a country. Okay. And that was constitutional. It was under the law. Okay. And why did they do that? Because they recognized the power that it gives to people to own that media, to be able to spread information, whether it be good information or bad information. So we have a lot of corruptions, okay, that have come up, okay, and our civics, our education, and our journalism hasn't, done us good. And another corruption is we have not enough people in Congress. We should, if we looked at the founding fathers, we would have over 6,000 people in Congress right now, and that we would have a much better governing system. We wouldn't, the powers in the shadows wouldn't have the ability to corrupt as much as they've corrupted. But we've had a thing called the internet come along, and the personal computer, that have given us people the tools to fight this corruption.
On is me.
Okay.
And one of the ways that we're fighting this corruption is with books, okay? Because a person writes a book and it allows me to understand or try and understand what they're trying to say. And so this is a process, and I thank you all for coming, and onwards.
I'll let you have this.
Thank you, Kris. I've really picked up on the theme of mysticism that Paul and Liz's book, The Valediction, presents to us and challenges us with. You can't live too long without contemplating spirituality, the invisible realms. If you pay a little attention, you do meet people who have seen ghosts and have had very, very psychic experiences, if not near-death experiences. I personally know someone who died in the operating room, then revived, and the next time I saw him, he was a changed man. He was just astounded to describe how he classically, from the ceiling, looked down and watched and heard, and then reported when he came back what the medical team was doing for him. To my knowledge, that has been formally studied for decades, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of case studies that are available for us to find. And if you layer that with what quantum physics says energy is, the stuff of which we're made, there's a tremendous freedom and empowerment about the power that's in our hand, if not our invincibility, if not the discovery at the moment of death, oh, this was all some kind of a intentional adventure we may have chosen to have. And now, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out today.
Thank you. So I'm going to start now. And first, I'd like to welcome you to our 7th roundtable. It is an adventure, and it's continuing to be one. And we certainly hope that you're going to find this one a particularly interesting adventure. I'll start first with a short overview of how we ended up going from the politics of Afghanistan to Oliver Stone's magical mystery tour. Americans believe that Muslim holy warriors who fight in faraway lands are a relic from the past and dismiss the idea as anachronistic. But what most are unaware of is that there is also a mystical component to the warriors who fight for America. That realization was the beginning of our understanding that all war is holy war, and we wrote our books to help guide your way through that. While doing our research, we discovered a trove of esoteric history surrounding the West's attraction to Afghanistan. It revolved around the religious concept of mystical imperialism, the term first used to describe the 19th century British imperial efforts to colonize the world by applying Judeo-Christian values. Simply stated, mystical imperialism legitimizes the conquest of other nations by infusing a sense of the divine into the raw politics of empire building. Today's American holy warriors represent a core of ideological defense intellectuals, military officers, and soldiers who combine their esoteric and religious beliefs with Washington's policy making. These individuals can trace their philosophical DNA back to the 19th century European esoteric societies who were involved in espionage on both British and Russian sides. Reflected in the Masonic exploits of Rudyard Kipling's Two Soldiers in The Man Who Would Be King, this occult game for control of Afghanistan and Central Asia played a major role in the foreign policy of the 19th century for the British and the Russians, and continues to this day through the United States. Described as the world island by early 20th century British geostrategist Halford Mackinder, Russia's position at the center of the Eurasian landmass rivaled Britain's as an island fortress. From the outset, a Russian dominance of Central Asia spawned nightmares for the British. From Halford Mackinder to Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Grand Master of American foreign policy, controlling Eurasia represented the ultimate goal of American strategic planning. Not until the presidency of Jimmy Carter was Brzezinski able to advance his objective by luring the Soviets into an Afghan trap to achieve his goal. Our initiation into the mystical realm began 6 months before the December 27, 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. While we were producing a documentary for televangelist Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network, the station had been airing The Salt Syndrome, a film railing against the passage of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty that would limit defense spending. Our documentary was to be the rebuttal to the Salt Syndrome as required by the Fairness Doctrine. We were aware that Robertson was already engaged in a religious crusade to change America. While working on the documentary, our eyes were opened to a growing movement of powerful interests pushing America into a holy war against the Soviet Union. By the time our program aired, the argument was no longer whether our government should call a halt to the nuclear arms race and reinvest in the civilian economy. The game had changed. According to President Carter, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War and had to be answered with increased defense spending. According to Brzezinski's own admissions, the truth was that 6 months before the invasion, President Carter enabled propaganda support to the insurgency intended to draw the Soviets into the Afghan trap. When the Kabul government expelled Western media 1 month after the invasion and imposed a news blackout, we jumped at the chance to see what was going on and secured visas to enter Kabul for CBS News. And what we saw in the spring of 1981 was in stark contrast to what had been airing. And after struggling with our footage for a month, CBS aired a segment about the Soviet troops we didn't see. Despite the fact that we had the first look inside Kabul in 18 months, our PBS documentary received meager distribution. When a third opportunity arrived in the spring of 1983, we returned to Kabul with Harvard Negotiation Project Director Roger Fisher for ABC Nightline. From the moment they entered the White House, the Reagan administration had demanded the Soviets withdraw their forces, while at the same time keeping them pinned down through covert action. His hypocritical campaign was embraced by the entire American political spectrum, and Roger Fisher's effort was ignored. Once again, to our dismay, we could not break the stranglehold on the Afghan narrative maintained by the mainstream media. By 1987, we were so frustrated with getting nowhere at changing the narrative. We had to question all our assumptions about journalism. If facts did not matter, what did? That's when we looked at our story from a personal perspective and wondered what had called us to the Afghan story in the first place. And we started writing screenplays. And then in September of 1991, our 10-year-old daughter, Alyssa, told us about a dream she had with Paul's deceased father. He was accompanied by a man wearing a Scottish plaid suit with bell-bottom trousers and a matching hat. The man told Alyssa he was 800 years old. We already knew that the Fitzgerald family had come to Ireland 800 years before as mercenaries for Henry II, and decided Alyssa's dream was a mystical message to dig deeper into the past for answers. 3 months later, we saw Oliver Stone's film JFK and found the inspiration we'd been looking for. Stone's decision to include the involvement of an esoteric secret society with deeper motives resonated with us. In our research into the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169, an enterprise largely run by the Fitzgerald family, we had discovered historical reasons why members of some secret societies might have wanted to eliminate JFK in the modern era as retribution for past crimes. We then developed the voice research with the hope that Stone would become interested in this esoteric perspective too, but he wanted our Afghanistan story instead. Once we began to work on the strip, the mythic implications of the Afghan story emerged, with many of the documents preceding the crisis were declassified. As we trailed the clues, we found esoteric references in Washington's official policy to the Manichaean War of Light Against Dark, whose origins began in the region now known as Afghanistan. And then we discovered a synchronistic connection we could not have imagined. One of the books we were reading was written by an ex-CIA agent about the British efforts in the 19th century. There were photos of Brits and Afghans and of the battles they fought. And then we found a photo of an American wearing a Scottish plaid suit with bell-bottom trousers and a matching turban. It was Alexander Gardner, a mercenary who found his way to Afghanistan in the 1820s. He settled in the mountains and married an Afghan princess. He not only lived the real life of Kipling's Man Who Would Be King, Gardner provided information for Kipling's novel. Alyssa confirmed that day when she came home that the soldier in the photo was the man from her dream. When Stone offered to take on our Afghan story, the one we had walked away from in frustration 30 years ago, we thought it was about making a film. But instead, what he introduced us to opened our eyes to another world and crossed us over into something we hadn't noticed about ourselves by taking on this story in the first place. Working on the script became a way of understanding the multidimensional nature of narrative creation. And in creating the Afghan narrative, the realm of the Holy Warrior Network revealed itself to us. Looking back, the most startling revelation about our work was realizing that as a Vietnam veteran, Stone was himself a member of that warrior network, and that by writing our story, we were unconsciously giving it a voice from the ancient past. That effort resulted in the Three Knights of Desmond script concept that Stone loved, but after 3 years, he wasn't ready to commit at the level we needed, so we went on our way. 30 years in the making, we finally brought that concept to fruition as the Valediction, Three Knights of Desmond, and Resurrection. As we have learned from Stone, the experience of participating in the violence of war for whatever reason separates the soldier from the civilian in ways that often defy rational explanation. War's deep mythological roots date back to the origin of human consciousness. The futility and madness this human paradox induces is dramatized in William Butler Yeats' play On Bale Strand, in which the mythological Irish king Conchobar tricks his fiercest warrior Cuchulainn into killing his own son. The madness of Cuchulainn's despair drives the mighty hero into the sea, where seeing Conchobar's crown on every wave top, he takes up a battle against the onrushing tide until he is consumed by it. Real war pushes every soldier off solid ground into this mythic sea. The path for the soldier who is ready to avoid the tragic fate of Cuchulainn is what we are addressing in our books. And now Paul will read chapters about our immersion into the mystical realm of the Holy Warrior with Oliver Stone as our guide.
Chapter 23. The dreams were forcing both of us to reconsider what we'd been doing in Afghanistan and what had happened with my father's visit to Alyssa with the 800-year-old man. They also made us realize there had been a deep mystical component to Afghanistan that I'd simply overlooked. I had not gone off to war in Vietnam like Oliver Stone. I had made my war Afghanistan, but as a storyteller. My mother thought he was interested in me because I hadn't gone off to fight the war like him. But little did she know I'd been fighting a war within myself for most of my life. Afghanistan was the most significant geopolitical event of the late 20th century. As the storehouse of ancient knowledge and the seat of human civilization, Afghanistan connected everyone to the deep past, whether they knew it or not. Kipling had written about it its mystical allure, and a Senate Select Committee on Narcotics had even acknowledged the unseen mystical powers of its drug-dealing holy warriors in a report dated January 3rd, 1985. I had secured the document years before, but now I saw in it a power I hadn't recognized. The Fitzgerald family had started out in Wales as Christian holy warriors in the 11th century, an area steeped in Grail mythology. The family chronicler, Gerald of Wales, was an authority on dreams, visions, and Merlin's prophecies. If the Mujahideen holy warriors operated a mystical communication network acknowledged by an intelligence community in the 12th century, in the 20th century, why wouldn't the Fitzgeralds have operated one in the 11th? And if they had, couldn't it still be active and used to communicate with its tribal members today, like my father had done with Alyssa in her dream? The idea was stretching the rational, of course, but the more I looked at it, the more I realized how profoundly limited the rational could be. I was beginning to understand what the intelligence community wanted with the esoteric powers of Muslim holy warriors, and why a 14th century French king and a pope would get so worried about the holy warriors known as the Knights Templar. Yeah, they had the king's money, to be sure, but they also held secrets that made them extremely powerful esoteric warriors. And so did the Fitzgeralds. Everything seemed to be connecting me to the past, linking me with some distant voice to fulfill an ancient purpose. Because of Oliver Stone, I was now on the alert to the hidden aspects of everything I'd come to know, and not just Afghanistan, but Ireland too. As we researched, with the dreams intensified, just after I'd met Stone in New York, I found myself transported to a rustic farmhouse somewhere in Texas. Two young women dressed in satin dresses entered the room, accompanied by a man with a rifle who stood guard while they spoke to me. "We are here to invite you on a mission from our Lord and Master David Koresh to fight the growing evil and power of Satan in our land," one of them said amid the sound of electronic static in the room. "There are many benefits to joining our group and many lovely ladies here to attend to you and your needs." I was suspicious in the dream. "Yes, the power of evil is growing," I replied, "and I support anyone's effort to change the world for the good, but I would never support any effort that required violence against others to succeed." At that moment, men dressed in black Nazi-style helmets and uniforms burst through the door and began to shoot, while the guard behind the women started shooting back. Afraid, I turned toward an open window and jumped through, then rolled to safety onto the grass. As I escaped, I even noted as I ran how much it reminded me of rural Texas. The next morning, I told Liz about the dream and how I felt I'd been summoned to it. I told her about the strange holographic nature of the encounter, about the electronic squawking in the background, and how the women's voices kept cutting in and out. I thought nothing more of it until 2 weeks later, when I opened the front page of the Boston Globe and read about the Branch Davidian standoff with federal agents at Waco, and realized that's where I'd been. The dreams even overlapped with realities. I'd found myself discussing production issues with Oliver, only to receive a fax unexpectedly the next day regarding the same subject. Liz's overlapped as well and became deeply personal. On April 12th, she told me I got a call from Elizabeth Stone asking when I start my job with Oliver. She told me she is concerned about him carrying this burden alone and is anxious for my work to begin. But despite my suspicions and the dreams, the vibe established by Oliver and partner Janet Yang was positive. After we'd arrived at Ixtlan's Santa Monica office, we were ushered into the big kahuna's presence with Janet and Azita bringing up the rear. And that was when the fun began. "Azita, bring in the shoes," Oliver said, shouting out to his assistant. "You want them now?" she asked politely. "Yeah, bring them in. I want to try them on." And so as we watched, as Azita marched in a half dozen boxes of men's shoes and placed them beside Oliver's chair in front of us. "Go on, Paul," he said as he proceeded to try on one pair and then another. "You were going to say something." I actually wasn't going to say anything, so I waited for a long 30 seconds for Oliver to finish, and then we began in earnest. "And so where do we go from here?" Oliver asked. "There's a lot of options," I said, deciding to wing it for fun. "How about Paul Newman as Paul Nitze organizing the Team B to undermine the CIA?" "Hey, who's the director here?" Oliver answered, half joking. "I do the casting." Okay, so it's someone who looks like Paul Newman, I said. It opens with a symphony orchestra playing Bach. Nitze loves Bach. Nitze is the conductor, swirling his baton, commanding all the stars in the universe to conform to his will. He's got a mystical streak. His father's an expert on Grail mythology. He studied Spengler and Ouspensky in Swedenborg when he went on sabbatical from Dylan Reed. Went to Germany in the 1930s and met with Hitler. He is the great architect of the Cold War, the father of the Cold War, a vast imagination in the power of will, the triumph of will. And if he wants the Soviet Union destroyed, thy will be done. Janet smiled at me, and then she looked at Oliver. That's a really good pitch. How did you do that? Are you in the business? Are you in this business? I was inspired, I said. Because of Oliver's shoe routine, I knew there were no rules. Oliver was intrigued. You said something about the mystical. What's mystical about Afghanistan? He said. What isn't? I replied. It's ancient, maybe the most ancient home of Gandharan Buddhism, Greco-Buddhism. Alexander the Great stopped off there looking for the Philosopher's Stone. His men stayed and founded cities. And then there's this, I said, searching into my briefcase. It's from the Senate Select Committee on Narcotics, requesting the Mujahideen to use their, quote, mystical communication network to stop the drug trafficking. It says so right here. Where? Show me, he said, as I got up to hand him the report. Right here, I said, pointing it out. You can keep this. Oliver was more than intrigued with the document and especially the implications. I want you to put this in the rewrite, the mystical. Get it into the treatment. You always work it out in the treatment. I will certainly try, I said, taking a deep breath. Can you do it? Liz asked as we headed out of the office into the warm Santa Monica sunshine. I don't know, I said, basking in the glow of our momentary victory. We'll see. I noticed the impact of weaving the mystical into our story almost immediately, when on the 5th of May, Liz told me about an awake vision she had that morning. I woke up at 4:30 and saw a white horse standing over your side of the bed, she said. He looked so real, I had to reach over to scratch his head and nose, and he responded to me. The horse hairs felt very real, rough like a wild horse's mane whose mane had never been combed. Maybe that's a signal from the last Earl of Desmond. Giardiarla, I said, laughing. As the story goes, he rides a white stallion around Logur once every 7 years until the end of time. Something we're writing is stirring his spirit. It took me 3 more weeks to craft a new treatment called Afghanistan, 3 Nights of Desmond, that wove a mystical character into the story with a name central to our research on the Fitzgerald family in Ireland. Desmond Fitzmaurice, I called him. Liz was contrite. So Desmond is the area your branch of the family controlled in Munster. How clever. It's a composite. Desmond means South Munster, I said, and Fitzmaurice means the son of Maurice, she added. And Maurice is the father of the Desmond Fitzgeralds, the son of Gerald and Nesta and the brother of William Fitzgerald, David, the Bishop of St. David's in Wales, and Angerard de Barry. Liz's interest was growing. And your father's name is William, and your great-grandmother is a Barry. And that takes us right back 800 years into the mists of medieval Ireland through 3 nights in Afghanistan and a stop at the Kabul Hotel. Wow, that really is mystical, Liz said, genuinely impressed. We dated the treatment May 27, 1993, and overnighted it to LA before the ink was dry. Oliver loved the new treatment, Liz said after getting off the phone with Janet. He's going to call this afternoon at 4:30 and give us some notes on how we should handle the rewrite. I was beginning to think there was something more about our mystical connection with Oliver that couldn't be explained. It's brilliant, he said as we listened on the phone, especially this character, Desmond Fitzmaurice. There's so much I can do with a character like that. If you can get the draft done on time, I can make it my next project. You and Liz can come out to Aspen and we can work on it together. Somehow I'd passed every test Oliver had thrown at me so far. All that was left to do was to draft a polished version of the screenplay I'd already written with a mystical slant, and my job would be complete. What could possibly go wrong? Chapter 24. Before getting off the phone, Oliver handed it over to Janet to tell us that they'd been asked by a staffer for Congressman Lee Hamilton, who'd helped out with the JFK film, to come to work in LA, and would he be an asset to our Afghanistan project? To which I answered yes, thinking a seasoned staffer could get us some of the needed documentation that was only then being declassified. I had no way of knowing that this Washington insider was the son of a deep state player and would eventually reveal that he wanted nothing to do with our story. At first, Eric didn't seem like a problem I couldn't overcome. Both Oliver and Janet were enthusiastic about our project. What was a problem, and one that became more apparent as I moved into the rewrite, was a question I had been avoiding from the beginning. What had drawn me to Afghanistan in the first place, and why had every step right up to Oliver Stone unfolded like clockwork? That was something I had avoided, something I had built a wall around, something about myself that came rushing back at me as soon as I'd finished the new treatment. And it seemed to speak to me in the voice of the Black Knight from my dream. Are you ready to join us? In the original treatment, I had put a distance between myself and the story. I had tricked myself into thinking I could tell it without making it personal. Now I had to write about that experience with the help of my mystical alter ego, Desmond Fitzmaurice. And for the first time in my life, I was lost. I was now on my own journey to Ixtlan and didn't know where it would take me. As I sailed into uncharted waters, I realized I couldn't make the drama work without knowing more details about what Zbigniew Brzezinski had done. Who had ordered up frontline Stinger missiles for the Mujahideen Holy Warriors? What role were the Chinese playing before the invasion? I knew Brzezinski had enrolled them in his plans in 1978 and that a Chinese operative was working with the Shah of Savak. Did the Maoists in Kabul have a hand in kidnapping the American ambassador? And what about the Safari Club? Brzezinski had put himself in charge of the CIA's covert operations at the National Security Council. The Dub's kidnapping was manna from heaven for his agenda. Did he know about it ahead of time? I picked up a copy of the book Crossfire, on which Oliver's JFK was based. I also picked up Oliver's The Book of the Film, documenting the volumes of research supporting the movie. Both books relied on 30 years of discovery, interviews, and detective work by dozens of researchers. Afghanistan was based on my personal experience and the firsthand knowledge that the Soviets had been tricked into invading. And most of Washington had thought it was a good thing. If Oliver still got raked over the coals for a heavily documented JFK, what was going to happen because of Afghanistan? In the meantime, things began to get rough. In late May, Oliver's wife filed for divorce, and as the summer progressed, changes started to happen with new people brought in at Ixtlan. Rumors circulated that Natural Born Killers was so violent it wasn't going to be released, and Heaven and Earth was struggling. We learned that Eric had been pushing a script on Richard Nixon, which would require all of Oliver's attention and a huge budget. June turned into July, turned into August, as I struggled to pull the pieces together and make Afghanistan work as a film. Following the bombing of the World Trade Towers, the FBI had uncovered a vast terror network linked to Brzezinski's heroic freedom fighters. Afghanistan was now a big story about CIA blowback, which continued to absorb every minute of my day. But as I wrestled with the geopolitical story well into the fall, the implications of mixing my role in Afghanistan with the mysticism of Ireland was crossing over into Liz's reality in real time. I woke up suddenly, Liz told me on September 9th. There were bright lights dancing on your side of the bed, multicolored lights. I kept staring at them as they got closer and closer until they began to take form and turn into little people dancing and rocking back and forth. Little people, do you mean? Those little people, I asked. Yes, those little people, the fairy folk, and they were very busy. Their dancing seemed to be bringing them into their reality. Then I realized they were celebrating something when a man who looked like Henry VIII started to wave at me. Henry VIII, with the fairy folk? I said skeptically. He just looked like that with a beard. Anyway, I was surprised that he could see me, so I waved back. Then I noticed a huge blonde lady hovering over you and the fairy folk with her long hair hanging down to my level. She was smiling and watching the celebration. I just kept watching, and then I felt wrapped in a frequency with a hum surrounding the whole room. Sounds like you dreamt of Anya, the goddess of beauty and the mother of Gerardiarla, I said. But this wasn't a dream, Liz added. As the scene began to fade, the fairy folk dissolved back into the beams of light. Then it finally faded. The hum was gone, and the room was back to normal. But you were awake? Yes, Liz said emphatically. I was awake. By October 25th, I'd produced a 154-page epic that we overnighted to LA, and that was when things got seriously weird. when 5 days later, on the eve of our 16th wedding anniversary, Liz received a visit from Oliver in a dream. I found myself in the vestibule of an ancient temple, she said. I was sitting on a stone bench looking out into a dimly lit room with an altar surrounded by large Greek columns. Liz told me the next morning with a strained look on her face. It was unlike any dream I've ever had with him. I watched as he serenely floated in with his feet suspended off the ground and sat down next to me. His eyes were black and hypnotic. He was smiling and I was pleased to see him. We were both dressed in long ceremonial robes and we talked of things. What kind of things? I asked, growing concerned. I can't remember, Liz said. Then I found myself alone on the bench and next to me was a drawing of myself and I realized a ceremony had taken place, but I couldn't remember it. You rushed in holding a small paintbrush announcing, "You did it, you did it. Did you fall in love with him?" But I couldn't remember what had happened. I took the brush and started painting stars on your back. Stars on my back, I said, finding myself wondering what the hell was going on. What kind of power are we dealing with here, I asked. I was tense enough waiting for a response to the screenplay I'd sent, but this was pushing me to the limit. Liz's dream had blurred the division between waking reality and sleeping so profoundly, I was feeling it as a threat. All that sorcery and trickery and not remembering what happened sounds like Castaneda, I said. As the days passed, I could feel the darkness growing. Then on the night of November 3rd, I revisited a dream I'd had in Afghanistan 10 years before in the medieval church with the Black Knights. By that time, I knew the location because I'd stumbled across a picture of it. It was Wewelsburg, the castle of the Black Sun, Himmler's esoteric headquarters in the North Rhine-Westphalia region of Germany. The Black Sun symbol was a pagan rune used in Nazi mysticism to conduct unknown rituals, which I now suspected had something to do with the mystical communication network of holy warriors. I had performed the Mithraic renunciation ritual in my first dream at this place. The Mithraic rituals represented the Aryan Indo-European foundation of the Grail quest going back to Afghanistan before Zoroaster. But in this dream, I found myself helping to unload wooden crates into the aisle of the church. As I brushed the snow from them and saw the markings, I realized they contained the remains of SS soldiers who had died fighting on the Eastern Front. Himmler had intended the war in the East to be a Teutonic crusade and named the operation Barbarossa in honor of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I's Third Crusade, who had drowned crossing a river on his way to fight it. I now accepted the dreams as a regular form of communication. Driven by the need to know, I read up on everything I could find about dreaming. A volume by Oxford fellow Robin Lane Fox on ancient pagan religious practices revealed a detailed history of dream communication between gods and men. He even referred to sorcerers who, quote, offered spells for conjuring up prophetic dreams and considered the arts of dream seeking and dream sending to be a central part of their business. Sorcerers conjuring up spells to seek dreams and send dreams sounded an awful lot like Castaneda to me. And when I found a copy of his book, The Art of Dreaming, I decided that I would try to send a dream to our favorite director and see what would happen. Chapter 25. Studies were just emerging about the military's use of what they called remote viewing. The techniques for putting yourself into a trance state were simple enough for anyone to use. The scientific basis for viewing something or someone in a faraway place had recently been accepted by researchers and documented by Michael Talbot in his book, The Holographic Universe. Communicating on such a frequency was no secret to the Mujahideen holy warriors. Castaneda's work indicated that South American shamans had been doing it for millennia. So on the 15th of November, in the dwindling light of day, I decided to lie back on the couch in my office, close my eyes, and wait for the red image to turn blue. I then concentrated on reaching my target by repeating his name 3 times with intent, and the result was almost immediate. I drifted through a cloud like haze, then found myself in an outdoor cafe facing a cathedral across the plaza in what looked like Mexico. I was sitting with a young woman who was trying her best to distract me from interfering with Liz and Oliver, who were sitting nearby having an intense conversation. I was aware at that moment that I had had other experience like this, where Oliver set me up with someone while he focused on Liz, and I was getting annoyed with it. Tell me what he thinks of me, I asked. He told me that you were deceitful, a house of mirrors, she said. Every time he gets inside the house and thinks he knows who you are, another door opens and someone else steps out. The encounter was meaningful. I woke up and went downstairs at 5:30, but before I could tell Liz what I had done, the phone rang. That will be Oliver, I told her. What did you do? She said suspiciously. I used the mystical communication network, I said, surprised to see the result materialize so quickly. Hold on, I'll put Paul on, Liz said, putting her hand over the receiver. He's annoyed, she whispered. Stay on the line. I'll take it on the extension, I said. Hello, Oliver, how are you? I'm calling you from South America, he said, backing off when he heard my voice. I'm scouting locations. I had to move on with plans for another production, so I'm putting the Afghanistan film on the shelf temporarily. So what does that mean, I asked. I'm going to do your film, just not right now. Well, what about the script, I asked. It's getting there, but it needs more. More what, I asked, hoping for a clear direction. I need a book, something that lays out the whole thing from beginning to end. But that book hasn't been written, I said. Why don't you let me write an annotated version and put background notes in it? You know, things that back up the story. Would that help? Yes, it would. But look, I've got to go. Do it again and put the notes in and I'll look at it. And that was it. He agreed that you should write it again, Liz said, hanging up the phone. Well, that's something, I suppose. So after months of laboring to improve our Afghan story and add the mystical, I embarked on revising the screenplay again. Afghanistan had been a fruitless effort for us for 7 years. We'd done all the heavy lifting and had did nothing to show for it. Oliver had dragged us back into the soup, and we'd gone willingly, solely because of him. But this latest setback had hit something in me the wrong way, and by the night of November 17th, I wanted to get out. You've been acting strange all night. What's going on, Liz asked just before bedtime. This writing thing is making me crazy, I said, feeling angry and paranoid. Something is conspiring against me. I can feel it pressing me to reveal myself as if I'm some kind of cutout. That night before I drifted to sleep, I told Liz I'll be gone by morning. They've been with me all my life. I've lost some of them over the years, but the last of them will leave because they can't stay. I don't know who will be left, but I can feel them departing. I was more than angry. I was furious at what I felt were my best warriors deserting me when I needed them the most. These were the secret forces I'd appeased by throwing myself into Afghanistan in the first place. Now that I was exposing them, they were leaving me. At 2:22, I awoke from a nightmare with a feeling of having been eviscerated. Liz heard me struggling in the dream and was already awake. What's going on, she asked. I was frantically building and rebuilding this wall of black blocks, I said, barely able to catch my breath. I finally realized something was grinding them down faster than I could rebuild them, so I stopped. Then I heard the sound of a chorus of wailing voices, mourning in minor scale, like falling angels. As the wall began to disappear, I looked back and saw a black pyramid. It kept disintegrating until all that was left was this empty room underneath it. I thought it was empty. Then I noticed this two-dimensional shadow figure pressed up against the back. As that wall disintegrated, the figure floated up and out toward a mirror at the other end of the room. I gazed into the mirror and I could see the face of an entity that looked something like Rudolf Steiner's bust of Ahriman. He stared back at me and bellowed, "You cannot live without me. For thousands of years, I have given you direction and meaning, and now you just throw it all away." You just encountered Ahriman, the father of lies and the god of the material world, the demiurge, Liz said. Wow. Then what happened? She asked. I reached out and I broke the mirror. I smashed it and felt as if I'd been expelled from heaven and thrown down to earth, that I had died. It's this damn work for Oliver. It's killing me. Liz was sympathetic. Paul, you got the message in your remote view. Didn't the woman tell you Oliver thought you were a house of mirrors? Well, you just broke the mirror. Oliver didn't do this to you. He just tricked you into doing it to yourself because you wanted it done. I fell back to sleep and was back in the dream. As all the walls were lowered now, the pyramid was gone and even the room underneath it. All that was left was the broken mirror in the middle of a blank square. The only black was the reflection of darkness in it. But as I watched the mirror begin to reform, pieces pulling themselves back together as if challenging me, Some part of me wanted that mirror back together. Some part of me wanted that black pyramid. Some part of me wanted the mirror that Ahriman had brought to it. I had to decide what to do, and I did, by pulling the mirror off the wall and shattering it once and for all. Only this time, I set the mirror on fire. As the smoke cleared, I could see the glowing white ball that I had tried to free in a dream a year before had been released. And as it burst into flames, it filled the blank square with light, and I fell into a deep sleep.
That concludes the 3 chapters from the Valediction Resurrection. To just give you a kind of taste of the level of the mystical experience that we actually had for 3 years, of course, working with Oliver, but actually it has never stopped. It was most intense when we were working with him, and it continued throughout the 90s, especially through finishing The Voice, which was the original story that we had brought him, and we continued to develop that throughout the rest of the 90s after we left Oliver at the end of 1995. So that is an attempt. I think we were really trying to establish what we consider to be a level of a validity, okay, of this process that is actually alive and waiting for us to actually engage it. And so many people, I think, have taken the position that this is not a very important part of what we have to do. And we have come to see it as the most important thing we actually have to bring back into our lives is the mystical. Because right now, the holy warriors own the entire realm of the mystical, and we've got to get in there as soon as possible and help neutralize that imbalance. So that's it, folks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you. This is when y'all could unmute, say my name. We'll try to, have some order, but who's got the first question or comment? Susan in the chat said so much of this resonates with me, to me as well. Dean, very powerful and beyond timely. Liz and Paul, how would you advise we so we can ripple for the rest of our lives and spread some kind of tangible something, like I said earlier, to look at a couple of topics, develop one spiritual imagination. What would you advise in a general way, maybe, that get in a, that's my question. What would you advise in a way that we would then ripple for the rest of our lives, that we would blossom and bloom and continue to get more and more empowered personally, individually for the rest of our lives? And what would we share with others that could help?
So I have always taken the position that you really have to begin to accept that you are already living a mystical life. You're just not conscious of it, that's all. So all you have to do is literally accept the validity of it at a level that, and I think that is the key. You have to actually accept it at a level. You see, Paul and I literally got thrust into it. We didn't have this capacity before we started working with Oliver. That's when it was completely opened up to us. We actually were a very realist, serious journalists who were very disgusted with what we experienced with the mainstream media. By going into another way of viewing our dilemma, we didn't know we were going to walk into the mystical. It wasn't a part of our consciousness. We didn't have any, in fact, before Oliver, I always thought of dreams as private. I never considered there was such a thing as a communal dream that we all are sharing. And when you're conscious of it, like if you actually encounter someone in a dream that you actually don't know, you're going to assume, like most of us, like I would have back then, that's just a dream. But when you actually, so we actually had the experience with someone that we realized actually had some real power in this realm, and we didn't know where it was coming from, and we didn't know why it was, why we were engaged in it. So it gave us a level of reality that just simply, it's like an initiation. I think, in fact, when you mentioned the near-death experience, I think that is probably a very good example. Once you embrace it at a level where you see it in everything, you take every bit of it seriously. You recognize that when you eat, you are having transubstantiation. You don't actually need a special ritual to recognize that it's always happening and it's always around you and it's always in you. And so by enlivening to that, but there's another reason too. I want to make this point because I want to motivate you to realize we have to do this. If we really want to, invoke what we're trying to invoke right now is the idea of bringing to life the dream that JFK had for the world. Okay, we really feel that is actually what the power of the imaginal realm is you first begin to form what you want for the future. Well, if we don't start forming a future we really want to walk into and only focus on the horror that we're experiencing and the frustration of not being heard and not being able to break into their narrative and change it, it's like, don't worry about that. They're going to go to their graves believing in the narrative that they're holding on to. But that doesn't mean we have to be stuck in it. So this is why the first step to creating a new future is in the imaginal realm. And that's why we have to do that.
I heard somebody recently say, they asked C.J. Hopkins, the humorist and playwright, they asked him, how are you able to be such an accurate political commentator? You seem to be ahead of the whole game in terms of what's going on between the East and the West and everything else. And he says, because I'm a playwright. He says, I go through all the potential scenarios all the time. And I see it from the beginning to end and the way these things happen. So the way he basically summed it up, this is what happened to us. I had been in theater. I had been a performer as a young man. And I had the experience with that. I was in the Magic Flute, that wonderful Mozart opera with Sarah Caldwell back when I was 13 years old. And so I remember thinking at that time, I was forced as a child to think, what is this crazy opera all about? What is this story? Sarastro, Queen of the Night? At any rate, that was my.
Thank you. And I want to look at a couple of these chats and then open it up here. Give these folks a chance. Zan writes, thank you. This is an amazing moving book. And Paul, your reading style would be great also for an audio book. George asks, how do we get back into the mystical? George, do you want to unmute and elaborate anything on your question or just leave it to the table?
Well, yeah, I was just, she sort of answered, I think Liz said that we've got to get back into it through our own imagination. So that pretty well answers my question.
Yeah.
All right.
That I had. All I'm saying is then are we going to be using magical methods to overcome something that we're describing as sorcery or what?
I don't necessarily, I wouldn't refer to them as magical. I would refer to them as innate abilities that have been unused for thousands of years. That we all have. We're all in possession of. And that, I would say, first of all, simply by starting, shut off the TV set. Don't listen to anything. That is rule number one. And the radio as well. Start to trust your own instincts about what it is you're seeing and feeling and hearing. We have been so cocooned in the West, particularly. If you go to Eastern Europe, if you go to various, parts of the world over the years, over the last 50 years, you get a completely different perspective on what the world is. We went back to Afghanistan after, in 2002, after the war started, and the kids there were they were like kids were supposed to be anywhere. They didn't care the fact that the buildings had been bombed. They were just glad the war was over. And the spirit of a human being, you could see it right there in front of you.
So it's almost like trying to come out of this system, this worldly system, and try to reinvent something that is up on the good, on the light side of truth and spirituality. Is that what
Exactly. And those good things will come because the seeds of that goodness are already in you. They're in all of us. And that's what has to be emphasized. I mean, there are all kinds of religious doctrines that talk about good and evil and everything else, but Manichaeanism, black and white, used to be considered a heresy. And it was not just by the church in Rome, but by a lot of people, it was considered a bad thing.
So we have to come out of the delusion then that we have been drawn into by these manipulators and these sorcerers who are practicing all kinds of techniques on us.
Yes.
Right. Well, there's no question that, you know, we have been basically propagandized and educated. It goes
Right. We've been conditioned into a system of delusion. Yeah.
Well, but let's say that, you know, we've all gone through it. We've all been living in this. This didn't just start in the last 100 years. You've got to go back thousands of years to really see the evolution of the process of this elite class of, I think of them.
I see.
High priests and this concept of royals that were created and that somehow were able to convince obviously all the people to accept that they had this ability and right to basically rule over the people, and it's basically worked. So now we're ready to say, well, we may want something different.
So it's like the battle on Lake Van between Nimrod and Hike, then maybe. That we're realizing the conflicts that existed between these major figures and how they've impressed upon the world a system of slavery and thought slavery and rule.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah, but I think that the important thing I think to remember is when we get into the idea of we're dealing with good and evil, that innately shuts down your ability to really engage people. I think you have to always start with the fact that, that from everyone's own perspective, they are on the side of good. I think
yes. Everyone thinks that they've got it. See, everybody thinks I'm the one that's got the truth, right? Nobody else does, right? Okay.
And with permission, thank you. I don't
want to take any more time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, George. I want to catch up with Catherine, asked to comment. Catherine, please unmute. How are you?
Liz and Paul, this is so beautiful to hear all of this. And I too resonate very much with it as a person who's been a screenplay writer since 1990, who went through a lot of what you went through with John Milius, was my director, and dealing with Hollywood. And I came back to the U of O and attended school and learned a lot about why my film would never be made. It was because the protagonist was a Nez Perce Indian, right? Wow. It is also indigenous belief. Indigenous belief is actually quantum mechanics, which is that, and as Carl Jung talked about, the collective unconscious. We can all access the collective unconscious. We're all connected, and that's quantum mechanics. Everything is connected, and that's an indigenous belief that everything is alive. The rocks, the trees, and our ancestors are within us. So now science is proving our DNA memory go back and back and back. In researching my story about Jackson Sundown, his Indian name was Blanket of the Sun, I had the same things happen traveling to Bear Paw, where Chief Joseph, his uncle, surrendered. I had a vision at Big Hole. I was there in 1877, and I went with Nez Perce holy people. And when I got to Bear Paw, it was a commemoration of bones, repatriation of burying bones from the battlefield the Smithsonian had in the basement for 100 and some years. It was when Paul was talking about the minor chord weeping, lamenting. Minor chords are pentonics, actually are healing. And Paul, you're my generation, all our music of the 60s and minor chords, a lot of it about love. But I just wanted to say that what the journey that you were on, when you are a screenplay writer, you're creating a three-dimensional world. And it somehow if you build it, they will come, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because quantum mechanics works on resonating with feeling. And if you build with sound, like a soundtrack and a set and costumes and words, the power of words actually invoke the other world to come to you into what you're building. And I think that happened.
And that's, that's a great contribution to the accumulating conversation we're having about this potential power. I want to keep moving on to a couple other. We have a new question from Matt, who says, since you bring it up, what understanding did you get from the magic flute as far as it relates to this history you've been touching on? What do you think Mozart was trying to do as far as it relates to changing society?
I just can't, I can't say enough about Mozart and the magic flute. It's just the drama that is portrayed in that opera. I've relived in my own life on many, many occasions, and I've seen the analogous way in which it's happened. And it, the music, the influence of music in my own life, and the process of these forces that are there, they're archetypal forces. Now, that was something that was, I'm very well aware of the fact that over the years that there are archetypal forces, and that the Black Knights are something that keep recurring in my mind. And we had that experience, that someone even said to me at one point, well, what you had when you dreamed about Black Knights, that's an archetypal dream. And that's true. It is an archetypal dream. And then Liz and I went to Ireland and we met the Knight of Glen, who is in our branch of the family. And I got home and someone gave me a book of Irish castles, and it turns out he's the Black Knight. He is the real Black Knight.
Well, I think the point we can make here is that it's about recognizing that the archetypal forms are actually present in people.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, this is the way that you really begin to recognize that it's when you actually bring it into yourself or see it in someone else. And that begins the process of, I think, bringing it down to earth. So what we have to do is actually bring a lot of the power of this world filled with our myths, filled with the images of the mythology and the archetypes, and then really bring it down to earth and have it become a part of what you're living with. As you mature, it begins to change. When you're a child, you have a very different perception, okay, of the exact same, like, let's say, the trickster, okay? As a child, I think we mentioned, that in the dream that Paul had, where I said to him that Oliver actually got you in this remote view to do what you wanted to do. He was playing the role of the trickster. Well, I actually had a dream, okay, one of my first dreams about Oliver with my whole family. And all of a sudden in the dream, I realized he was the trickster. That's what so to actually see the reality and how it played out in our lives and felt real and began to believe in the validity of it and the effect. So it's a subtle realm. It is not a realm that obviously, can be as present as we want when you're under the kind of pressure we are right now with the fears of the war that's going on in Ukraine, obviously. And how do we reconcile, something like that with, trying to bring, JFK's peace back, to the world. Well, we have to do both simultaneously. That's the point. We really have to work on both at the same time. And we can't take the position that when there's no money, there's no art in school. We all know, we lived through that nonsense, that it was always about, meat and potatoes, no vegetables, or no fruit, or, none of those things that go along with the core things. We can see that that's really not a very good way of solving the bigger problems that we have to deal with.
I want to thank you. I want to catch up with Susan, who has written in here, stack, please. Susan, I'm not sure what that means. And then down below, you wrote the mention of Lee Hamilton is a standout. Please explain.
Well, Lee Hamilton was on the 9/11 commission report. He was one of the commissioners. And I've been involved in, I'm actually working for the 9/11, the lawyers for 9/11 inquiry with Charlotte Dennett, who is on this call. And Lee Hamilton was a very interesting subject because he later on started making noise about how the commission lied, kept information from the commissioners, and was underfunded, and then started fighting for releasing information that was secret about the financing of 9/11. Right after he started making noise about it, his wife was killed in a freak accident.
Oh my God. Wow.
She was taking the dog to a vet, and she had her car in park and pulled the dog out of the side door. And strangely enough, the car ran over her.
Wow.
Now, how does a car run over someone from pulling a dog out of the side door? And that's when Lee Hamilton stopped making noise about the 9/11 Commission and the underfunding and the financing. So that was a standout. Liz and Paul, we go way back. Our connection with the Knights Templar, I'm directly descended on my father's side from the founder of the Knights Templar. So I resonate very deeply with what you're saying about the blood of our ancestries, moves us still.
You remind me of Harry Truman's quote, "The only thing new in the world is the history you don't know." How endlessly fascinating history is, and good books. Susan, with your permission, I'll catch up with some other
Sure.
folks here. George, I see you've quipped here. How do psychopaths factor in? We could run with that, or do you want to elaborate a little on your point on that, George?
Well, I just want to say that these people are at the highest level of the most enslaved people that we have in the world, and they've got the money power behind them. So that's all I want to say really about them.
Right.
No,
Well,
and I want to just repeat what Paul and Liz have taught me in the course of these months of working on these roundtables, that power over others drives people mad. So that Paul and Liz have posited that as far as those who would rule an empire. And I certainly have been a student of human nature, and not only my own wants, needs, and desires and motivations, but those of others, because I used to be an actor, and I used to also be something of a playwright. And why does anybody do anything? And I get tons out of the concept of projecting. Psychopaths maybe hate themselves, can't admit that, therefore they hate others, and that's part of projection. I want to catch up with a couple other.
Right. You're right on. You're right
I
on
want to
top
make
of
a
that.
comment about
Sure. Yeah.
directly try to answer George's question.
Sure.
What we're dealing with is literally, the great, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, that also, absolute power also is the basis of a psychopath. Okay. And we all know that that's the whole point about imperialism. And we would like to announce that we think it's time to end imperialism. We have to understand, what it is, what it was, but I think it is the source of this problem which includes psychopaths, which includes a lot of the energy going into war instead of peace. And obviously the transition that we have to make this huge transition of going from war, which has taken over. We are now in endless war, but that is really that is actually what would happen whenever you inaugurate anything. And this is the duality, okay? You're going to have to go through the whole experience. Well, I think that's the point. Many of us have reached the point we understand we have a big problem. We're completely engulfed in the war side of things. How do we rebalance? It's clearly not just an issue of turning off the war, because we have all this power and all this energy that's gone into it. And these people are definitely, they cling to this, and this is all part of it. That's part of our research into the neocons and the whole history, going back to the Soviet invasion, leading to now, that has really been very trackable about the addiction of the war mentality that's now taken over, obviously, most of the US Treasury at this point. So in terms of being able to, first, I think the important thing is recognizing, what is really happening here and thinking about what you really want to come out of this, and making that determination in a way that factors in as we begin to rebalance the world without prejudice. And that's why I said you can't approach anything as evil, because that automatically sets up your duality. We've got to get to a trinity. We've got to move beyond the duality. And that's all part of it. Once you've exhausted it, you're ready to move on. And we're trying to get everyone else to come with us. So we have to establish that for ourselves. As we establish it, we become a resource for others to move away, who are basically, in many cases, just scared, or they're terrified to actually confront this thing. So this is all part of in the numbers.
And you said in this answer to move away from empire, which I framed as those who are psychopaths because they have power over others. It has polluted them to want more power over others. It reminds me of resurrecting JFK's dream of world peace. He taught the founding ideals in many, many ways, and which is the consent of the governed, which kind of solves, it's the antidote to those who want power over others when you realize, no, you can't have any power over others that others don't consent to. And that's how we all play nice together in the same sandbox and making up our own rules about how we're going to function as a society. I think that catches up with that question. Charlotte has a question regarding Ukraine. Charlotte, how are you?
Yeah, hi everybody. Glad to see you again. Yeah,
Hi,
I already asked you this, Liz, but actually there are many of us that are really probing the origins of the war in Ukraine and going back and back in history to try to get the full context. And in my little chat with you, if you could expand on it, what parallels do you see between the Russians going into Ukraine in a big way now, and some feel like they fell for the trap, let's put it that way,
Well,
and what happened with the invasion of Afghanistan? You see parallels, etc.
Well, first of all, the Soviet Union was actually already in a desperate state. It was already collapsing. The fact that they were so foolish at that point to think that they could have any kind of a military operation that went on eventually for 10 years, and they had to leave primarily because they couldn't afford it anymore. So you're really looking at a very different situation right now with Russia. I think that in terms of the fundamentals, okay, about coming to the end, we're coming to the end of what was the Soviet Union, okay? Russia has actually been a transformation. I know that there are many who have, I'd say limited information about some of the things that have actually happened in Russia since since Putin got in 1999. The country was a basket case. Right now, whatever he isn't doing that people like, the country has been rebuilt, okay? A lot of reinvestment in the infrastructure, a lot of, the basics that people need to live has actually been going on. So again, in terms of just showing that, you're dealing with a collapsing society in what was going on in the Soviet Union. And of course, this is also, very much, the neighbor issue and the conflict that we do have with the West. And we know what happened in Afghanistan, and we do see the earmarks, we feel, of the same kind of attitude coming from the United States towards Russia that they had towards the Soviet Union, which was that once something happens, for whatever reason it happened, they want to take advantage of the opportunity. That's what I think. There are similarities, I think, in that. But then again, I think that is the core fundamentals that happen to overlap. But I think we're really dealing with a very different kind of country than the Soviet Union was. I think there are a lot of parallels that really end at that point. And so that would be my point about the limit. What the outcome of this might be, obviously, we're all hoping that there's going to be some kind of a negotiation that works. That's the only thing that really is going to solve this.
But both sides have to be willing.
If I could just add, I just wanted, do you hear me?
Yeah.
I just wanted, one parallel I found, however, was the neocon involvement, in the war in Afghanistan. And now this one, Victoria Nuland, I only recently discovered that she was a neocon and that she was married to the guy that put out the project for the New American Century. And she's the one that did the coup planning. And she's very much involved now as the part of the State Department of Biden. So, from my geopolitical perspective, the similarity I see is that they are the neocons who actually seem to be allied again with the Brzezinski faction. Brzezinski's son is now the U.S. ambassador to Poland. What's that about? It is part of accomplishing, the great dream of America being the world's superpower forever and conquering the world. I just wanted to throw that out.
That's right. And that's the argument. That's if I'm hearing you right and following things, it's the argument in a nutshell that for the last many years, American and Western policy has kind of squeezed Putin into having to take a desperate action. And now with the sanctions and everything else, that the real target is the West's targeting of Russia to squeeze and destroy it. Is that basically this scenario that we're more or less describing?
At this point, unfortunately, it may not be over in terms of the impact of these sanctions, because what's happening is that there is a de-dollarization of the world that's going on now. So there are other effects that this could have, dramatic effects on the American economy and on the the individual personal economies of average Americans dramatically can be affected by the de-dollarization effect, where the Treasury no longer is going to be backed by the reserve currency. So these are issues that are all part of what's going on too.
Right. And to explore this a little more horrifically for a few minutes, and I am saving the last few minutes of this to refer to Susan's note here, which I'm not going to read right now, and how it relates to, and how things relate to our future in the very hopeful vein that was painted and brought forth by the bulk of this roundtable, talking about our potential mystical, if not spiritual power. The de-dollarization and the threat to the world's economy, Liz, that you just described, there's tons to be forewarned as adults who can handle the truth, as bleak as it is. It's part of the evidence of these puzzle pieces that look like an intentional collapse of the world's economy, if not just America's economy, is a big, perhaps, goal to slap a digital currency onto us that we would access through our phones. And then comes all the nightmarish conspiratorial theories. The end of the world is nigh, about the kind of slavery that would be. Definitely something to study. Definitely worth a few minutes of commentary. Yes, Liz?
I'd like to make one quick point about this issue about the digital currency and whole use of technology. You have to keep in mind that the people who are basically behind the technology actually think that technology is going to be smarter than people. Well, that says to me, they don't understand what it means to be a human being, okay? I mean, it doesn't matter how fast, basically, a computer can, calculate something. That's all it really can do. And it's no smarter than whoever programmed it. And I don't think these people really think outside of a very mechanical box. They're really very much themselves, kind of, they're turning themselves into AI, but we don't have to do that. And I think that's where the imaginal realm is so important, because computers and AI can't think the way we can. We can actually imagine something that never existed before for ourselves. It's the ability to be creative and to think and then create ideas that affect other people's thinking. Then we all come together with this common goal. But that's why if you really think of something as a solution and positive things that everybody needs and wants, that's how we can come together. Right now, our world is stuck with too many people who are coming together out of their common hatreds. That is the problem.
Yes, and I'm going to claim one of the purposes of this roundtable and your work and my work and my book and other things is bringing into, like we've done today, what's possible, what might be real spiritually and at the core essence of reality. And when you look at the near-death experience survivors and you learn what remote viewing is, and you delve into what kind of communication dreams might have, and like it was mentioned, turn off the TV and sit in nature and experience reality, all the reasons to love life. Gently and slowly we can start hearing the birds again when we turn off the chatter of all the horror stories, the fire hose of negativity and fear that is meant to captivate us, shut us down, and make us controllable like puppets by psychopaths who want to exploit a population like that. All of the above, all these good, nice things are the antidote. Susan has written, have a clear vision of peace deep in our psyche, actually the potential of moving the world closer to peace. As MLK said, I have a dream. Susan continues, meanwhile, all this geopolitical battle goes on. The Ukrainian people are suffering greatly. Yes. Matt says, spot on, Liz. Thank you for the excellent advice. Bruce Dean says, Kris says, Catherine had her hand up. Catherine, have you more too? Okay. We've got a few more minutes left. Anyone want to ask or contribute something you have not asked or contributed yet?
Well, if no one has anything to ask, we just published a paper. Basically, it's a paper that we've laid out. It's trying to lay out our concept about how to begin the process of bringing JFK's dream of world peace into reality. And it starts with it starts with how we came to that conclusion and why we believe it's a very important potential idea that we feel. How many people in the world wouldn't say yes to bringing forth JFK's concept of world peace? How many millions of people could we get to actually come together and believe that's exactly what we want? And the only way we can get it is if we all come together and actually begin to believe it's possible.
Thank you, Liz. And that whole point, your article, which is on what website, please tell us?
Well, I actually, it's op-ed news, but if anybody wants to, we have a link for it, basically. People can email us.
And links on the website.
Well, it's not up on the website yet. It's not up on the website. So
and the site is valediction.net.
Yeah, I don't think it's been put up yet. Anyway, I'm going to actually, I'll have it, but in order to, if somebody wants it, we can send the link out. So people can email us at gould.fitzgerald@verizon.net, and we can send you the link.
Repeat that slowly.
Gould.fitzgerald@verizon.net.
It's got a nice ring to it.
Yeah,
and
it's all lowercase, so it's pretty easy.
Yeah,
and you have to send people a link, but it's a good place to begin, I think, to see where our thinking is and what we're trying to put together to actually stimulate really a discussion. I think that's the thing. This is like our first effort. We want everyone to come back and think about what ideas do you have about making this happen.
Well, I wanted and to circle what Susan had said about cultivating peace in our psyche. All of this goes far to calming oneself down and generating some hope, because when more of us have hope, from that will spring a sense of, I can make a difference. And then we can look at what JFK had to say about peace, and for any specific advice, folks, read and listen to everything you can about what JFK said in the campaign, why he deserved to be president. He was making the case, and what he said as president, and how he was bringing the whole world to this round table, so to speak, about what do we want? Peace. When do we want it? Now. How do we create it? Well, dear, if you don't have it inside, you can't create it around you. So all this mystical and spiritual stuff goes very far to creating world peace. Half of our title is how it relates to our future. First, friends, get some peace cultivated, reasons to be cheerful in and of yourself, and then you can be a value to your family and friends who you have to negotiate what's for dinner, what should we do on Friday night. Let's work at the local level. Zan writes, distributed autonomy is a big part of recognizing our individuality and uniqueness. There are many in the digital currency movement who are working against the control of centralized banking. Distributed autonomy. Zan, do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, so I've been inspired by Paul and Liz for decades now. And I think the distribution of knowledge, distribution of agriculture, distribution of currency, the more we can be autonomous and empowered as individuals, the more we can realize what's been talked about at this round table. And so I just wanted to put a word in saying that digital currency isn't all bad. There are a lot of people in that movement who are trying to change things.
That's very true.
Remember, that's the thing about, when the duality. If you have goodness in anything you're doing, it's going to be for the good. But if you're doing it to control, if you're doing it, your common hatreds coming together, then it's for the bad. So it's not about the actual technology per se, it's about the attitude of who's actually using it. And why do we have so many bad, chemicals in the world and so many weapons in the world? And, so we know we're misusing our potential.
In about a month or so, we're going to have another roundtable, as I understand it. So I want to thank everyone on behalf of TrineDay, Kris, Paul, and Liz. I want to thank everybody for coming.
Thank you.
This was wonderful.
Onwards.